Not too long ago, I released this video going over my Resident Evil journey. Since making that video, I've basically finished every Resident Evil game that I feel is the most important, with the only exception being Code Veronica, and yes, I will play that too. But that's not the point of this video. I just finished the original RE2 from 1998, and also the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis from 1999. But I want to focus on RE3 Nemesis for this video. I even posted about it on Twitter when I finished it, expressing how great it was in comparison to the remake, and even a couple Capcom employees liked that post. Make of that what you will. Now, my experience with this franchise had me playing the remake first. When I finished the remake, I thought it was a genuinely decent game. Nothing crazy, but just decent. After playing the original though from 1999, I don't feel that way anymore. Not even close. The remake is a joke in comparison, and I would not have said that before playing RE3 Nemesis. This game shows you exactly what that remake should have been, and it's not even subtle changes either. The difference is in, the ambition of the game, the absurd amount of cut content. It's basically night and day. I can already picture people who only played the remake thinking it was pretty good. I was one of those people, but if you haven't played RE3 Nemesis, then you need to. Not only will this game completely change how you look at the remake, but you'll also experience one of the best Resident Evil games in my opinion. In fact, I think RE3 Nemesis is within my top 3 of the entire franchise. Oh, and shout out to this guy who thinks I sound like grade A under A. Now, before we get into the nitty gritty of why I think the original RE3 Nemesis is a lot better than the remake, we have to talk about the story. The first thing you need to understand about RE3 is it's in a weird place in the timeline. It's basically a prequel and a sequel at the same time. The game actually starts 24 hours before Leon and Claire arrive in Raccoon City in RE2. Jill is already there, seeing the infection spread and watching the city fall apart in real time. Now, from the start of the game, you can see the streets are a complete mess, and Jill is just doing whatever she can to get out alive. She's meeting other survivors she encounters, trying to scrap together some kind of escape plan. And that's when Nemesis shows up. Poor Brad gets impaled right in front of us. In the remake, the story starts off with Jill Valentine in her apartment, and you can see a clear difference in the tone. This Jill in the remake is suffering. She's got clear PTSD from the mansion incident in RE1, and if I'm being honest, I do think it makes the character feel more human. And I do prefer the remake Jill over the original because, you see, in the 1999 original, Jill was more of a typical tough as nails action hero from the start of the game, which I thought felt a bit kind of random. And then we have the side characters, and this is one area where I think the remake does a pretty decent job. For example, Carlos. In the original game, Carlos was, he was a bit of a pretty boy cliche with a very questionable accent.
Ouch, my ears are ringing. We both should be deaf by now.
However, I think that's just the terrible voice acting of the older RE games. In the remake, however, I like that Capcom turned Carlos into more of a dependable protagonist, and his chemistry with Jill is actually great. They even gave him huge playable sections, specifically at the RPD. Now, I can only imagine for the people who played the remake at launch, this would have been a bit of a shock, because in the original 1999 game, Jill is the character that explores a police station, not Carlos. Moving that segment to Carlos in the remake changed that side of the story entirely, making the RPD feel like a bridge between his story and Leon's story in RE2. And then there's Nikolai. Now, in the original, your choices, which is that live selection system I'll talk about later, could actually change how he died. Nemesis could kill Nikolai, you could even blow him up in a helicopter, or the main scenario, which I think the most people see, is the one where he just flies off in a helicopter. In the remake, he's a much more consistent looming villain. He's not only there for the paycheck, as now he's there to watch the world burn and collect his data. His ending in the remake, being left on a rooftop to face the incoming nuke while Jill and Carlos fly away, felt like a much more cinematic justice for such a prick. But overall, I would prefer the original version of him, as there is more to his ending, if that makes sense. But we can't talk about the story without talking about the tragedy of Brad Vickers. Now, in this game, Nemesis kills Brad right in front of Jill at the RPD gates, in what I could only imagine would be a very iconic moment had I played the game in 1999, which would be impossible because I wasn't even bloody alive then. In the remake, they changed it. Brad goes out like a hero, sacrificing himself in a bar to save Jill. It does lead to a cool lore tie-in, where he's the one who actually bites Marvin, setting up his fate in RE2. But it also meant that we lost that terrifying first interaction between Brad and Nemesis. However, I can see why people would prefer either the remake version or the OG version. I think both are quite cool. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the 9-foot tall mutant in the trench coat. If you're like me and you started with the RE2 remake, you probably remember the absolute dread of hearing Mr. X's heavy footsteps stomping on the floor above you in the RPD. It made your stomach drop because you knew he was actually there, roaming the halls and looking for you. So naturally, going into the RE3 remake, I expected Nemesis to be that, but on steroids. I mean, he's faster, he has tentacles for God's sake, he's literally programmed to hunt STARS members, he should be the ultimate nightmare, right? Well, that brings me to why the remake's version of Nemesis feels like such a massive letdown compared to the original. In the original game, Nemesis was the pioneer of the stalker mechanic. Back then, zombies could not even follow you through doors. You would go to a loading screen and feel safe. But nope, not with Nemesis in 1999, because you see, he broke all the rules. He would burst through doors, follow you across multiple rooms, and show up in places you'd already cleared. The most terrifying part was the unpredictability. While his spawns were technically triggered by your progress, they felt organic. You never knew if turning a corner would lead to a quiet hallway or a rocket launcher pointed at your face. In the 2020 remake, they took all the feeling of dread that you had and basically turned it into a series of interactive cutscenes. Now, don't get me wrong, the first time he burst through the wall in Jill's apartment in the remake, it's absolutely terrifying, and it gets your heart racing. But once you played for about an hour or two, you start to see the strings. Most of his appearances in the remake are heavily scripted chase sequences, where you're basically just holding forward on the stick and occasionally pressing the dodge button. There's only one real section in the downtown area where he actually stalks you in an open space, and even then, he's so easy to down with a single grenade that he stops being a threat, and to be honest, I'd even say he starts being a bit of a chore. The biggest crime though is how quickly he stops being a stalker at all. About, I'd say, a third of the way through the remake, he mutates into this quadrupedal beast. Once that happens, he's no longer hunting you through the streets, he's just a boss fight at the end of a level. In the original game, he stayed in his big ass humanoid form for the, majority of the game, which made him feel like a constant personal shadow. It's actually quite baffling because Capcom already had the perfect blueprint with Mr. X in the RE2 remake. I know a lot of people would have wanted that level of persistence, but with Nemesis' speed and aggression. Instead, it feels like the developers were too afraid to let the player actually get cornered. For a game literally named after the guy in the original title, he's barely in the remake as a functional mechanic, and that's a huge part of why the whole experience to me feels so pale in comparison. One of the biggest things that makes the original RE3 stand out, and something I was very surprised to find missing in the remake, is the life selection system. Back in 1999, the game would occasionally freeze time. The screen would flash white, and you'd be forced to make a split-second decision. Do you jump out the window to escape Nemesis, or do you stay and hide in the basement? Do you push him off the bridge, or do you jump off? It sounds simple, but these choices completely changed how your game played out. Depending on what you picked, you'd end up in different areas, you'd find different items or see entirely different cutscenes. It gave the game this incredible sense of agency. You were pretty much deciding how Jill survived the night. It also gave you a massive reason to replay the game, because one choice early on could lead to a totally different encounter with Nikolai, as I mentioned earlier, or a different ending for Carlos. In the remake, all of that is just gone. Every single one of those iconic moments has been turned into a cutscene, where you have absolutely no input at all. For example, in the original, the first time you meet Nemesis at the RPD, you can choose to fight him or run into the station. In the remake, that whole sequence is a scripted chase event where you don't have a choice at all. By removing live selection, in my opinion, Capcom stripped away the personality of the original game. It turned a branching, unpredictable survival horror experience into a, straight linear line. In my RE1 and RE2 playthroughs, I love that feeling of what if I did this differently, but with the RE3 remake, there is no what if. Every single person who plays the game sees the exact same story, in the exact same order, with the exact same outcomes. It makes the whole thing feel a lot more one and done, and for a franchise built on replayability, I think that's a huge step backwards in my humble opinion. If there is one thing I've noticed from watching videos and reading up on people's opinions on the remake, it's the discussion around the cut content and the changed features. When I finished the remake for RE2, I was blown away by how they took the original RPD station and expanded it, making it feel bigger and way more atmospheric. So naturally, I assumed RE3 Remake would do the same thing for Raccoon City. I would have loved to see those iconic streets in the RE engine. I would have loved to see the scale of the outbreak. But instead, it felt like the remake only really focused on some of the more important areas of the city and pretty much neglected everything else. Let's talk about the missing locations, because this is what I mean when I say pale in comparison. In the original 1999 game, Raccoon City felt like an actual city you were lost in. One of the better locations I explored in the OG game was the St. Michael Clock Tower. It was this massive gothic building that served as a, major turning point in the story. It had some pretty interesting puzzles, a clock puzzle, there was a clock tower bell puzzle, and I think there was one more that I can't remember. I thought the atmosphere was very, very good, and it was the site of one of the trickier fights with Nemesis, which I'll be honest I struggled with because I went into that fight with barely any healing, so I had to restart from an earlier save file, but it was worth it. In the remake, however, it's basically a backdrop. You literally stand in front of it for a boss fight and then that's it. You never even go inside. Imagine if in the RE2 Remake they told you to just stand in the parking lot of the RPD and fight a boss, and then they just skip the entire building. That's how it felt. And it doesn't stop there. They completely cut the Raccoon City Park and the cemetery, which is one of my favorite locations. In the original, these areas were eerie and they expanded the world building, showing how the infection was rotting even the natural parts of the city. It also featured a gravedigger boss fight, which was a huge terrifying giant worm that added variety to the enemy selection. By cutting the park and the worm, the remake feels like it lost a huge chunk of its DNA. Even the finale was swapped out. The original ended in the Dead Factory, an industrial waste facility that felt like a desperate, dirty corner of Umbrella's empire. The remake replaced it with Nest 2. Now Nest 2 isn't bad, but it's just another clean white high-tech lab, and as somebody that played RE3 Remake after RE2 Remake, we literally just spent the end of RE2 in a clean white high-tech lab. It just felt like a massive case of copy-paste instead of, giving RE3 its own unique identity. By cutting all of these locations out, they changed the pace entirely. The original felt like a cool, journey across a dying city. You were moving from the uptown streets to the police station, to the downtown shops, into a massive clock tower, to a park, and finally into a factory. There was simply progression. In the remake, it feels like you run down, I'd say maybe 2 streets, hide in a sewer for 20 minutes, and then you're suddenly at the end of the game. And I disliked that because it made the whole experience feel claustrophobic in the worst way possible. Thinking of it now, for a game that's supposed to be about escaping a city, it's a huge bummer when you realize just how little of that city you're actually allowed to see. It's these missing pieces that make the remake feel like a quote-unquote shittier version of a genuine masterpiece. And it's the main reason why even in 2026, somebody like myself who's a new fan of this franchise, by the way, I will literally go back and tell people to play a game from 1999.